Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. How's the food? Everything good? You getting enough? Good. Well, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join the Mercatus Center and George Mason University and our two very distinguished speakers, one on his way back here from votes. I want to welcome each and every one of you and underscore and acknowledge how important it is that you are here. Oftentimes, we would like to get members of Congress sitting where you're sitting, and we do that. Oftentimes, we will do this on the Senate side. We are doing it on the House side today, and we have some of the most important people in Washington, D.C. here. I say that as a former staffer, not as a former member of Congress, but as a former staffer who worked on the Senate side as a staff assistant to a United States Senator, working on trade, working on defense, and working on appropriations issues. So I recognize how valuable your time is. I recognize how much the congressmen and congresswomen rely on you in your individual offices. So thank you for carving some time out. You probably will have more email to go back to, more work, and maybe even the LD if you're not the LD, or the Chief of Staff if you're not the Chief of Staff, is going to wonder where you are. And they're buzzing you on your BlackBerry now. We think these kinds of forums are some of the most important areas for staff to learn about different issues because of the quality of people we get here. We don't just want to see a debate, sparks fly, when debates occur. Debates often happen, and you all have come into this room with a particular position that your boss has had for several years, and as good as you all are, you're not going to change your boss's mind given what takes place in this room. But what the Mercatus Center tries to do is to introduce maybe some new events that may be taking place in the world into the debate. Tries to introduce an opportunity for staff to engage the speakers and ask them some questions that your boss is certainly asking you, or may be introduced into the debate this year on an appropriations bill, or later this year coming through one of the committees. So we very much appreciate your time. We try to provide a value-added product that is beneficial to you, and please let us know when there is a speaker, when there's a forum, when there's a program that can help you and help your member of Congress understand these issues and add to the debate and the outcome and the policy formation for the United States Congress and the important role that the Congress plays. The oil tycoon, J. Paul Getty, was once asked the important question in a forum like this: how is it that you succeeded? And he took the time to say, well, it was three things. Three important ingredients led to my success. He said it was hard work, it was getting up at the crack of dawn, and it was discovering oil. Now, if everybody could do those three things, you're going to make it. Well, we really believe that hard work and getting up early are two of the key ingredients for a great staff. Understanding these issues and taking answers and a different kind of understanding of a complicated policy question back to your office to talk to different people about what you might have learned in an event like this. Many of you would come to this event maybe knowing what your boss is going to say and what you think. You might agree that for more than 40 years, Cuba has had a dictator that none of us support. You might all agree that there is a brutal human rights policy with too many people imprisoned in Cuba. We might all agree that there needs to be some approaches after 40 years that will make our trade policy, our human rights policy, our policy to get rid of Fidel Castro more effective. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, however you voted on this issue in the past, I think that's something all of us may hold in common. We may also look at the issue of what new things have happened in the last several months that Mauricio and Congressman Flake might consider in their presentations today and might impact the debate coming up before Congress. One important question is Fidel Castro's health. Will the Cuban dictatorship outlast the iconic and brutal Cuban dictator? And how does U.S. policy try to impact that change? Secondly, the business community continues to work with different segments and components of the economic community to promote trade and to look for new opportunities in the world. President Bush has said open trade is a force for freedom in China. How do we promote trade to get changes in other parts of the world? And the business community seems to be working on these issues more and more in concert. And thirdly, at least according to some of the polling that I've seen, things may be changing in the electoral situation in American politics. There was a recent poll of Cuban Americans in Miami conducted by Florida International University. The results said 65% of those that were asked, they would support the U.S. government beginning a dialogue with Cuba, up 10% from that same poll to the Cuban American community last year. How does that impact our policy? How does that impact votes? How does that impact the presidential election coming up? How does that impact a swing state like Florida in a presidential campaign? We have two great speakers to address these new questions and important questions. I'm trying to buy a little bit of time here to make sure that Congressman Flake shows up and can hear. Here he comes. Well, perfect. Congressman, welcome. I almost had to get into my third or fourth set of jokes to make sure that you could hear Mauricio's comments. Welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks, Adam.
You're welcome. The first speaker we have today is Mauricio Claver Carone, a very distinguished individual with a long list of academic credentials. Mauricio is currently the executive director of Cuba Democracy Advocates in Washington, D.C. Until November 2002, he served as an attorney for the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Prior to his work for the U.S. government, he served on the full-time faculty of the Catholic University of America's School of Law and has also served as an adjunct professor at the George Washington University National Law Center. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mauricio joining us today. Thank you very much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you very much for having me. As you'll see, I'm going to be here kind of at a disadvantage because I don't share the gift of speech that Congressman Roemer and, as you'll see, Congressman Flake share. So I'm going to start off at a little disadvantage, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Now, I think the most important thing, in order to understand, kind of the different economic aspects and everything of U.S. policy towards Cuba, is to understand what U.S. policy towards Cuba is. First of all, we always trivialize, U.S. policy. We have slogans and we have, words. It's the embargo, but it's important to first, in order not to do a disservice to the policy, to kind of understand the specifics. So let me just start off with kind of explaining what U.S. policy is. Essentially, U.S. policy basically says that we will not engage with this Cuban dictatorship commercially or politically until they essentially release all political prisoners. And I remind you, Cuba has the largest prison population per capita in the world. 2, respect and recognize the fundamental human rights of the Cuban people. And 3, legalize opposition leading towards free elections. We're not asking for a lot there. That's basically anything you would want for yourself, for your families, for your friends, etc. Now within that context though, kind of leading into the economic issues and others, it's important to kind of, debunk some of the simplifications, that many people, and particularly opponents of the policy, attempt to make. First of all, I'll tell you what Cuba is not. Cuba is not Costa Rica. Cuba is not Mexico. Cuba is not the Dominican Republic. Cuba is not a vacation destination. You can make it a vacation destination, but it's not. Furthermore, Cuba is not China, and Cuba is not Vietnam. Cuba is not an authoritarian bureaucracy. Cuba is one of a handful of totalitarian states in the world, along the lines of Burma, which you've been hearing a lot about now in the news, and North Korea. I can only stress so much the word totalitarian. Totalitarian means that the Cuban dictatorship controls every aspect of economic, social, and political life. Now, and I see mostly young people here, so very briefly, just to kind of understand what that means in someone's life, let me just kind of tell you what it is to be like a young person in Cuba. And I'm going to tell you through the eyes of, Jorge Luis Pérez García Antunes. Antunes was a young, college student in 1989. He's now 38 years old. On October 10th, he's going to turn 39. He has spent 17 years and 8 months in prison. He spent half his life in prison. When he was a college student, at the times that the changes were going on in Eastern Europe, he basically signed a document with some friends and he said, we want the same changes in Cuba as are going on in Eastern Europe. That's all he said. 17 years and 8 months later, he comes out of prison. Held and back 25 times. Now, Antunes wakes up every day and he says, my life really sucks. I have nothing to do here. I want to be a journalist. I want to write. I want to, I believe in the labor movement. I want to be, in the labor movement. I want to work. I want to set up, my fruit stand. I'm not allowed to do any of that. If I wanted to shine shoes, I'm not allowed to shine shoes. Not because the US embargo doesn't let us, because the Cuban government doesn't let me. Because the Cuban government has to authorize what you can work in. That's totalitarianism. And then Antunes goes, and he sees his house is falling apart, and he sees, that, he's pretty much a pariah of the state. His family suffers. His cousins and others can't go to school because he's an opponent. And then he goes and he sees this beautiful, everything's crumbling, and then he goes and he sees this beautiful resort. And look at this great hotel. And then he kind of looks over the fence, because Cubans aren't allowed into resorts. Cuba has an apartheid society. It's a life for tourists and a life for Cubans. And they're not allowed by law to intermix. Resolution number 10 in Cuban law does not allow, if you're a Cuban and you have contact with a foreigner, you have to report it. If not, you go to jail. Okay? So he looks over this fence, he sees this beautiful resort, and man, look at this, they got lobsters, and they got wine, and they got daiquiris. Wow, that's great. And as he looks over, then, of course, him and his friends can't go over there, but, wow, look at those, that could be my cousin, my sister, because prostitutes are allowed in. Well, so how does the Cuban government not allow regular Cubans, but they allow prostitutes into the hotel? Well, because they make money from that. So then you're sitting there, and then who's with them? Well, Germans and Canadians and Italians and all these, European and all this, sex trade there. And they sit there, and that really pisses you off. Because those are people that are taking advantage of your crappy situation. And forgive my French, I'm not very, like I said, I'm not very eloquent. So you sit there, and what do? You begin to hate those Canadians and those Mexicans and those Spaniards. Because they're out there with what could be your family. And they're taking advantage of your situation. And they don't give a crap about you. They're there to hang out in that apartheid resort with those young ladies and, forget you. But there's one country in the world that doesn't do that. There's one country in the world, their beacon of hope, which is the United States. We can do that, but fortunately we don't at this point. Okay, now, just so you don't think I made some of this up, let me just reference, because I guess that's kind of my law school days. I like to reference things. The 2006 Annual Trafficking in Persons Report. Cuba has a tourism industry, government operated or affiliated, and it engages in promotion of child prostitution, which not only trafficking under law, but under UN protocol, and it's done very openly. 2006 Annual Trafficking in Persons Report. The highly political Frommer's Tourism Guide. Right? Frommer's, so it is not politics, it wasn't done by a Cuban-American think tank in Miami. Frommer's. Farmer. One of the most disconcerting aspects of contemporary Cuba is the government's creation of exclusive foreigner-only tourism zones where Cuban nationals aren't welcome. Effectively, there are two Cubas, a reality that reeks of something akin to tourism apartheid, as observers have noted. It goes on and on and on. There are ultra-modern hotels, restaurants that feature imported products, English-speaking waiters, great, but a guarded border checkpoint beyond which unauthorized Cubans cannot pass. That's the truth. That's the reality. That's Cuba. So Cuba is not Costa Rica, Mexico, by far. It's not Cancun. Now, to the economic aspects. Trade with Cuba is not about trading with an entire nation. Once again, Cuba is a totalitarian state. Under the Cuban Constitution, only one company is allowed to engage in trade. That company is called Alimport. One company. Therefore, I'm a Cuban, I want to import beef from Nebraska, I'm not allowed to do so. Only Pedro Alvarez, God in Cuba, can say, I want to import, because Fidel says, or Raul now says, or both of them still say, I want to import, Nebraska beef because there'll be great lobbying for us, so that we can have the entire part of it. That's it. Cubans have no stake in this. Now, which is, by the way, I say it jokingly, but I always mean it. When all these, proponents of a lot of these legislations to, trade with Cuba, they always talk about, the Export Enhancement Act. I think, we should call it by what it really is. We should call it the Alimport Enhancement Act, because that's what it is. I mean, what you seek to do by, engaging with more trade with Alimport is promoting a foreign monopoly, one company. So let's call it what it is. Now, maybe, yeah, if you believe that, for example, you take down the mafia by doing more business with the mafia, which controls everything, then maybe by engaging with more trade and making Alimport even a huge, bigger monopoly and conglomerate might, help bring down the regime. I don't think so. I don't think that's the way the mafia came down, and I don't think that's the way you can take down the Cuban government's mafia. Now, the challenge of Cuban policy is how to strengthen the Cuban civil society without strengthening the regime. Now, I'm a supply-sider, and I believe in trickle-down economics to a degree, but you can argue against trickle-down economics. Now, trickle-down economics can work in a capitalist regime. Under capitalism, trickle-down economics can work. Basically, because there's inflows and outflows of capital. What I know for a fact, trickle-down economics does not work in a totalitarian regime. One company, all the money comes in, and it just kind of revolves around it. Doesn't get down. So if you don't believe in trickle-down economics at all, then you're not going to believe it works in capitalism or in communism. If you believe in trickle-down economics here, that's fine. But I promise you, it doesn't work in totalitarianism. Now, next. Cuba is not, debunking some of these things, is not about the right to travel. Opponents of, travel regulations to Cuba will refer to these as, restrictions on travel. The truth is the Department of Treasury's jurisdiction under the Trading with the Enemy Act is to prohibit or regulate commercial or financial transactions related to travel. Let's call it what it is. It's not travel, it's transactions related to travel. Once again, this is a totalitarian regime. The tourism sector in Cuba is owned and operated by the Ministry of the Armed Forces, the Ministry of the Interior, under a big company, it's called Gaesa, and they own everything, from the rental cars to the hotel to everything. It's a totalitarian state. I hate to be boring and redundant with this. It's totalitarianism. So once again, what would that leave if we eliminate these travel-related restrictions, particularly in regards to tourism? Well, basically, according to Cuba's own Ministry of Tourism, it would double to triple their GDP. Once again, totalitarianism, Alimport and a few other companies, double or triple their GDP in 1 year. Now, how does that benefit the Cuban civil society? I'm not sure. You tell me. All right. In regards to travel, though, there are 15 categories of travel. There are 15 ways you can go to Cuba, ranging from religious to academic to humanitarian to family. But go beyond that. What's even more simple is if you want to travel to Cuba, you can do it very simply. All you have to do is grab a couple of duffel bags, fill it up with humanitarian aid, fill it up with medicines, fill it up, with some things, some legal things, and within some limitations. And you go and you deliver it directly to an NGO. You go to Cuba and you give it to an opposition group, an NGO, a civil society group. Now, Cuba is a totalitarian state. Those are illegal. Therefore, the Cuban government will not look nicely upon you for doing so. And if they know you're taking duffel bags to give it to an NGO, they will probably not let you in. We understand that. But try anyway. It's good. It's good for the Cuban civil society. And I don't want to put any of your lives at risk. Anyhow, along this line, Cuba is not about exporting freedom through American tourists. Now, granted, us Cubans, we're not as smart, as people, in Washington or in Phoenix or elsewhere, But despite the fact we're not that smart, there are bills out there, and these bills are called, Export Freedom to Cuba Act. I love these, Export Freedom to Cuba Act. Let me just think of it in this way. 10%, these are Mao, Stalin numbers. 10% of the Cuban population is estimated has either died trying to cross the Florida Straits in these 48 years, being executed, or in prison. 10%. Add to that another 10% that's been in exile. That's 20% of some Cubans that, in 10% of the cases at least, have been willing to take the ultimate sacrifice because they understand what American democratic ideals are. Now, in addition to that, you still have this huge prison population, which is the first condition that we want to live in regards to lifting sanctions. And all those people in prison, I'm not saying they all have PhDs, but what I do know is they damn well know what American democratic ideals are. Antunes spent 17 years and 8 months in prison for American democratic ideals. Spring breakers are not going to teach them American democratic ideals. They are smart enough. Cuba is about the Antuneses, the Dr. Bissets, or Carilia Bisset, also spending 25 years in prison, the Juan Carlos González Leivas, Blind North, Guillermo Fariñas, and a hunger strike because Cubans aren't allowed to use the internet. Because you can't allow to use the internet, the Silvio Amaya brothers throughout, those people, these are our present day Sakharovs, Solzhenitsyns, Mandelas, Aung San Suu Kyi's in Burma. All those people I mentioned, from Dr. Bissett to Aung San Suu Kyi to Mandela, have one thing in common. They all ask the international community, do not engage economically with these dictatorships until our fundamental freedoms are recognized. That's it. Solzhenitsyn said it best. He said, we are slaves from the birth. He's the guy who taught us about the Soviet Gulag. We are slaves from the birth, but we are striving for freedom. You, however, were born free. If so, then why do you help our slave owners? It's a totalitarian state. Again, the bottom line. So, for me, I think there's no more, personally, insulting and borderline arrogant insinuation than to assume that, that democratic ideals, are going to be taught, in Baradero, Gallogogo, or Guin, or one of these other nice Cuban beaches by spring breakers. Because tourist areas are out of reach for Cubans, and if you have the context, you go to jail, you have resolution number 10, etc. It doesn't work. And Cubans were not stupid. We know, and Cubans on the island know what, democratic ideals are. So, once again, the goal of the policy is to provide leverage to the repressed Cuban society while denying the dictatorship the hard currency it desperately seeks. Is my time up?
Just about. Why don't you wrap up?
Okay, let me just wrap up. Finally, let me address the word, actually, I was going to address something else, but I want to address something that the Congressman made in his opening remarks, in case someone doesn't ask later, about the political demographics in Florida, et cetera, and talking about Florida.
No, your time's up if you're going to sit down.
No, just real quick. I want to address that real quick. Look, I've seen every poll that has come out since 1991. I've read them inside out. I've done polls. For every poll that comes out, I can show you another one that says the opposite thing. The same polls that every year come out and say, oh, well, young Cuban Americans is changing. Read the question. The question says, do you want to travel to Cuba? Yes, I want to travel to Cuba. You ask me, I'm a Cuban American. I support sanctions, as you might have gathered by now. Yes, I want to travel to Cuba. Now ask, do you support travel-related restrictions to Cuba until all political prisoners are free, fundamental human rights are recognized, and the opposition is legalized? Overwhelmingly, they will say, yes, I support the regulations. You can play the polls all you want. There's only one poll The one that comes out every 2 years and elects 6 Cuban American members of Congress, 4 House members, 2 senators, overwhelmingly. You want to know what Cuban Americans think? And I don't think we should base our foreign policy on what these people think, but if we're going to inject that into the debate, then there is your answer. Democracy in action. That's what we want for our people down in the island. So I'm going to leave it with that.
Thank you, Mauricio. I want to introduce very quickly the next speaker. Mauricio commented on how young all of you are in the audience. It was a long time ago when I met a young intern who was looking for a job in the senator's office that I was doing trade and defense and appropriations issues. And this young man walked in, had a very impressive resume. I interviewed him for the job, and I didn't know he was, did you put Republican on that resume? No. I didn't know all of his background. We hired him, and Jeff Flake did an absolutely masterful job for me and for the senator that he worked for. That's how I was introduced to Congressman Flake. He had a lot of important jobs in that office. He had research jobs, he had writing jobs, he had jobs to help us stay in touch with the constituents in Arizona. He also had an important job of making sure the senator's office was competitive in sports with other offices. As you all know, you want to beat other offices in the summertime in different sports that you engage in, and he's a terrific athlete, continues to be. What I most admire about Congressman Flake, as a Democrat speaking about a Republican, is his sense of honor and his sense of courage to go tackle difficult issues and stay the course and keep fighting against Washington established interests. Whether it's pork barrel politics, whether it's trying to take on his own leadership or the Democratic leadership on a particular set of issues, those ideals don't change when Congress changes. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican leadership or Democratic leadership, he takes on those same set of issues. That is something I admire in anybody in public service. He serves in his 4th term on 2 very important committees, the Resources Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. Please join me in a warm welcome to Congressman Jeff Flake.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I remember those days in Senator DeConcini's office. Yes, he was a Democrat. I've been trying to purge that from my record ever since. But I really worked under Tim, and I don't remember those other duties. I just remember shining his shoes. What I really remember is getting beat by him in tennis from the beginning, and I'm sure the same would result today. So. But anyway, I appreciate the comments that have been said so far. Let me just say, Mauricio asked the question, what is U.S. policy toward Cuba? And I would have to say, most people would say after 48 years, failure would probably be the best description. 48 years. Tom Osborne, my former colleague, who was best known for being head coach of the Nebraska Cornhuskers, a couple of national championships, great coach. He used to say, when talking about this topic, Cuba, he'd say, you know, when we'd run a couple of plays off tackle and they didn't work, we'd usually switch to a different play. At some point, you got to realize if it's not working, maybe, just maybe, there's something wrong with the policy. And here, I think it's easy to determine what's wrong with the policy is the lack of freedom with the policy. We tried Cuba and its human rights record and its record on freedom as well we should. Mauricio talked about how bad it is. We ought to stipulate that. I've been there several times. It's that or worse. Just because we have a totalitarian system there doesn't mean we should restrict the freedom of Americans to travel there. And that's what this is, what our travel policy is, putting aside the economic policy, which I think ought to change as well. But our travel policy is not a restriction on the Cubans. It's a restriction on you as Americans. And I have to disagree with him on one point. He mentioned that maybe we aren't as smart in Florida or the Cuban Americans as people in Arizona or elsewhere. I think that they are. And I think that they're smart enough in South Florida or anywhere else there are a significant number, particularly of Cuban Americans, to decide on their own what they should do. And that's why I would have a policy which says if you think you should travel there to see family, or if you think you should travel there for humanitarian reasons, if you think you should go to try to aid the dissidents, you should be able to make that choice, not somebody in Washington to decide whether that's good or bad. You should make that choice. No arrogant congressman from Arizona or anywhere else should make that choice for you. You should have that choice. So that's what I would say. I would, and also I would think that the notion that everyone that would travel to Cuba would just be there as a spring breaker, that everybody who travels to Cuba has the IQ of beauty pageant winner in South Carolina or something like that. No. You've all seen the YouTube videos. But the notion that everybody's a spring breaker going down there to lay on the beach, yes, there are some of those. Certainly there are. But to cast every American who wants to go to Cuba or who has gone to Cuba, I happen to know of a lot of them who have gone for very good reasons, religious, humanitarian, cultural, other things. There are many reasons to go there, and the moment that we lump them all into some tourist that wants to sit on a beach, it's simply wrong, and it's insulting, frankly. So I happen to think that tourism is a good thing. If you want to go there and lay on the beach, in the end, you're probably doing more to change the system than you are by staying at home. The Cuban government, it is a totalitarian government. They try to control everything down there. They don't succeed in controlling everything. When a taxi cab driver takes you somewhere, I'm not sure that every dollar goes back to the Cuban state. He probably, helps buy food for his family. You have to there. You just simply can't survive on what the state gives you. So they try to control it. They would love to control it, but they simply can't. That's not an omen. But when you go down there to travel, to the extent that the Cubans want to take advantage of American tourism, which would be great, it would be large, big, to the extent they want to take advantage of it, they're going to have to beef up their infrastructure. They're simply not capable of taking everything that would come. And in order to do so, they're going to have to respect private property. They're going to have some rights to contract. These things are anathema to the communist system that they have there now. So if they really want to take advantage of it, it's going to force change within that government. And that is a good thing, because after 48 years, I think we can decide, what we're doing is not working that well. What underlies, Mauricio correctly pointed out, that the restriction is not on travel itself. But how'd you like to hear that you've been given an no expense paid trip to Australia? I mean, that's not much of a gift. You can't travel anywhere without paying something to travel there. So it's a bit strange to say the restriction's not on travel. It is. You can't travel there without spending money, like you can't travel anywhere without spending money. But in order to, but then what underlies this policy is the notion that we can somehow restrict funding enough to the Cuban government that we can bring them down economically, that we can force change that way. And I would submit that that's simply not going to happen. After 48 years, they're surviving. Now, during the early 90s, they had it really tough when the Soviets pulled out. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the money and subsidies that went away. The early 90s were really, really tough in Cuba. If you think it's tough there now, and it is, just go back to that time. Their economy, whether it's growing as fast as the Cubans claim it is, which they say about 12% or 12 points a year, the CIA says it's about 8. Cubans always exaggerate those things, but whichever figure you believe, they're not about to be brought under, whether it's subsidies from Chavez or nickel mining from the Chinese, whatever the reason, we're not going to be able to bring them down economically by continuing the current policy. And so what underlies this policy, the notion that we can change, is simply wrong. There's a lot of money that goes into our policy now. and a lot of reasons not to change the policy. We're too comfortable with this. There is a whole cottage industry here in Florida and elsewhere to keep this current policy going. We spend upwards of probably somewhere near $50 million a year money to pay for humanitarian goods to be shipped, for radio and television marquee, for other programs at universities or think tanks. You say what you want about those programs, but that is a big industry that cries, don't change this policy. It's just fine where it is. And so it's very tough. It's very difficult to change it. And I have to say we've been unsuccessful recently in the Congress to have the type of votes that we've had in the past, much due to the efforts of Mauricio. They've done an incredible job educating members of Congress on things there and changing the way people have voted. So it is a difficult environment to have things change. And also, I've always said that, we just saw somebody go to Iowa the other day and have a conversion on ethanol subsidies, one of the presidential candidates. I've often said that just like we're unlikely to see rational farm policy as long as presidential campaigns begin in Iowa, we're unlikely to see rational Cuba policy as long as political campaigns seem to end in Florida. And presidential politics sometimes dictate that you take positions there that you probably wouldn't in any more rational year, put it that way. So it's difficult, but I hope we can change it. I hope that that in the end that we can have a little more freedom here, that we can trust Americans to decide for themselves whether they're my constituents or anybody else's constituents. They make that choice on how they can help Cuban people achieve what we want them to achieve. We have a policy now that says if you manage to get out of Cuba and you live here now in the States and your parents are still in Cuba, if your mother and father are getting old, your grandfather, grandmother are getting old, you have to decide when one of them dies, do I go to this funeral or will my father die within 3 years because I want to go to his? Can you imagine a policy that we have that tells a Cuban American that has family in Cuba, you have to decide whose funeral you're going to go to? Is there anything more wrong than that? To tell a soldier, Carlos Laza, who has family in Cuba, who came after serving a couple of tours in Iraq, to say, you visited your son in Cuba less than 3 years ago. You can't go back. What kind of policy is that? What kind of policy is that? That's simply wrong. So anyway, again, I am glad to be part of this. I'm so glad for the work that Mercatus does and for the forums that it puts together. And I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Well, we've heard about spring breaks and funerals. That's probably something you didn't expect coming down here to the lunch. Why don't we give Mauricio 2 minutes or 3 minutes to have some views about what the Congressman has said, and then the Congressman has that opportunity once again, and then we'll throw some questions at him.
Does this work? Does this work?
Yes.
I just to address a couple of things. Full disclosure, I am a fiscal conservative, so in that regards, we're good to go. In addressing the Congressman's first question about failed policy in 48 years, who supports the State of Israel, the creation? Can you raise your hand if you support the creation of the State of Israel? I do. I support it. It took 5,000 years for the State of Israel to be created. But anyway, 2,000 years. But that's it's still the right thing. Granted, this is not going to be 2,000 years before Castro goes and there's democracy in Cuba. But right things sometimes don't happen overnight. I know we're in the internet age and you want instant gratification, but sometimes. My apologies for all spring breakers. I guess I made the comment because I've been to Cancun, and I can really just picture Cancun and Varadero. Tourism is good, as the Congressman said. Tourism under apartheid is not good. That's the difference. That's really the bottom line. Tourism does not benefit the Cuban people, and the Cuban people aren't allowed into those resorts. That is the bottom line. In regards to, if Congressman said, you're right. I mean, there are people that want to go for humanitarian issues and for religious issues and to help the civil society. Most importantly, I like that one a lot. If you want to go for humanitarian and civil society issues, you can go now. So go. You know what I mean? So at the end of the day, that's pretty much the whole issue about when the Soviet Union collapsed. What we lost that opportunity in regards to the true economic doldrums of the Cuban regime, at the 1991. What we did, what our policy was to follow exactly what Congressman Flake advocates today. The Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, which came upon the end of the Soviet Union and the special period, was supposed to, at this moment, bring the Cuban government over the edge if we increased contacts between American people. It was called people-to-people contact. That was the phrase. In the Clinton administration, people-to-people contact, exchanges, etc. But what did the Cuban government do? They totally flipped it right over us. And what did they start doing? Well, they started extorting Cuban families. Basically, they started saying, okay, you guys can leave, but I'm going to keep your grandparents and your kids behind. Why? Because you accomplish two things. First of all, those people in Miami are going to be working just to send money back to their families. So you learn from the Mexico, El Salvador, and remittance example, and they can keep that regime afloat, at least during the special period. And then two, if your family is being held hostage back in Cuba, you're not going to speak badly about the regime in the United States. In regards to this whole family travel issue, that's extortion. It might sound bad. If my child is kidnapped, I'm going to want to pay ransom for my kid. I want to pay. If it's $2 million, I want to pay whatever it is. But we have a policy about paying ransom to kidnappers. Why? Because it leads to more of it. The more we allow this extortion, the more the Cuban government is going to do it, which I think is bad. And finally, in regards to Sergeant Laszlo's sons are in Seattle. Yeah,
You couldn't go there to see him.
Well, no, the big thing is because they had a visa that they wanted to come to the United States, but the Cuban government wouldn't let them out. But then after he started speaking, less kindly about, the human rights, then all of a sudden they let him out. That's the thing. It's extortion. It's extortion of thought. Even when you're abroad, you extend the regime of terror abroad, and that's very dangerous. So, one more thing. It's not about the policy. It's not about collapsing the embargo, collapsing the Cuban government. See, it's very simple economics. Here's the Cuban government. Here's Cuban civil society. They have all the money. Now, we lift the embargo on totalitarianism, and there goes the government, and civil society is still down here. We're not trying to, it's almost impossible to bring them to down, but what you want to keep is the civil society somehow afloat. Now, how do you do that? By keeping as much money away from them, not tripling their GDP in a year, and helping through a lot of these humanitarian programs, etc., the civil society at least be able to keep afloat. All we ask for, that's all we want, and it's imperfect, but the goal is correct, and I believe it probably is, and something.
Congressman, do you elect to take your time, or do you yield your time back to the moderator?
Let me just take one brief minute. The statement was made after Fidel dies and there's democracy in Cuba. I think that's another misnomer. We've been told, just keep this in place and the Cuban government will fall. We just have to outlast Fidel. I've got news for you. Fidel is pretty much gone. I mean, he's still there in his pajamas and shows himself every once in a while, but he's not running things. Power has been transferred for all intents and purposes, and there's still not democracy in Cuba. So this notion, that if we can just outlast Fidel, then, boy, things are going to turn over free and fair elections tomorrow if we just keep this current policy, has already proven to be wrong. So we need to change the policy.
So let me go right to a couple questions, and then please let's open it up and get your dialogue and your debating points here too. To that point, Congressman, with Fidel's health declining, with Raul transitioning into power, how do we take advantage of this current opportunity? What should we be doing to take advantage of this, to change the government, to make sure that we don't have another dictatorship, to address human rights? What would your 3 or 4 policy recommendations be?
Well, let me just say from the beginning, there's no guarantee that changing the policy will change anything. Let me say that from the beginning. There's no guarantee that if we allow people to travel or engage economically, that things will change or that quickly. But I think we know that they're not going to change continuing the current policy. But I think there's a greater likelihood that things will change if we do engage. Raul Castro has made some speeches, and some have interpreted as him being more open to economic change. Perhaps he is. I don't really know. And I don't think that we should take anything they say and say, all right, we're ready to negotiate with them or anything else. I think what we should do is what is in our interest as well, to allow Americans freedom. Travel would be the first. I see no reason for us to restrict the travel at all. You can start with families, but I would get rid of the entire travel ban completely. And then economically, there's no reason to continue with embargo as we have it. There will certainly be, Cuba is designated as a terrorist state. There are always limits that you have to consider when you deal with countries with that designation. But given that, we should do what we can to engage and change economically, hope that they will change economically and change politically as well. It's not always perfect, it doesn't always happen overnight, and continuing with the current policy certainly won't help. Also, a couple of things we can do is more cooperation with the Cubans on things like drug interdiction. We have had some limited cooperation that some people don't know about, where they have been helpful, and we've been helpful to them in terms of trying to stem drug trade. Second, with regard to immigration, we don't want an immigration crisis again. And if there's an upheaval or some kind of rapid change that would bring immigration problems, that's something that we could engage the government now of Cuba about. So there are some things we can do short term.
Mauricio, let me turn the question a little bit for you. Fidel Castro has survived 8 different United States presidents over the last 48 years. We failed to get rid of Castro himself. Where are the flaws in the current policy? I mean, you would say that one of the efforts should be to try to change the dictatorship. What can we do differently to try to get the changes there if the current policy has not accomplished what you would want it to?
I think we need to learn from history. We've been through in the same way there's no guarantee that if you change the policy, it's going to help get rid of Fidel. There's also no guarantee that when Fidel's gone, that there will be democracy in Cuba. It could happen. In the same way that if you change it, it might not. You never know. You don't know. No one here has a crystal ball. But here's what you do know. Like I mentioned before, in 1991, Soviet Union fell. A special period began in Cuba. Instead of saying, okay, here we are, let's just put all our aid into the Cuban civil society, we did it. We basically said, let's engage, with more travel, etc. And what did they do? They manipulated. They got through the special period, the income came in, it didn't work. If we learned anything from China since 1979, is this: people have forgotten the democracy war movement that began in China in 1979 with the door policy. When that began in the 1980s, it wasn't an economic reform movement in China. It was a political reform movement. It wasn't 5, 10, 20,000 people. It was hundreds of thousands of Chinese that culminated in June of 1989 in Tiananmen. Now, that, when the international community said, we care about business more than about political reform, remember, in the 80s, they were almost going to have provincial and municipal elections in China. We basically sold that entire movement out when it seemed almost like you couldn't hold it back in order to do business. Now, where are all those people today? A lot of them in prison, a lot of them in exile. Now, here we are, years later, and it's funny because now when we talk about China, we have all these, consumer issues, etc., and then people say, well, yeah, but, the rule of law in China is still what's kind of, accepted. Oh, so now we want to have political reform before economic reform. It's very dangerous because in the mid to long term, it is for the benefit. And it might take a little longer now, but it is in the benefit of the Cuban people in the long term to have political reform before economic reform. And what the United States can do is maintain that leverage and say, you will not engage with will be your number one economic partner. It's just natural until there is that political reform. It will come back and bite us in the backside.
One of the policies that the United States has often tried to use to leverage change in different governments, in South Africa, for instance, was multilateral sanctions. They're very difficult to implement, even when you get the world community cooperating with you. Can unilateral sanctions, just by the United States, work?
Well, I think that question has been answered when history informs us there. No. I'm not a big fan of sanctions. There are some times, like in South Africa, where you can see it had an impact. But that was multilateral. Here, it's us. That's about it. And whether we think that we're going to bring the other countries on board, I just think that is highly, highly unlikely. And that's what I mentioned. If we did cut off remittances completely, if we cut everything, every bit of travel that goes, I can't remember the figure, but I think the State Department's goals were to get, I think, about $500 million out of the Cuban economy that was in there. That's certainly a lot more than it is here in the States to their economy, but it's not anything that's going to bring them down. It just isn't going to do it. And so, yeah, multilateral or unilateral sanctions in this case just
Mauricio, any comment? We'll open it up for questions.
Well, I think you simplify it. Just put it down to the lowest common denominator. Think of it as companies that are blacklisted. We have companies in the world that either because they're criminal enterprises or they're involved in terrorism or whatever, we blacklist them. Basically, the United States, as a sovereign nation, says we don't want to do business with these people. These are bad people. You do it also put it in a local level. If the mafia is out there and it's a mafia business, you say, okay, we don't want to do business with this mafia. At the end of the day, take it away from the economic part, etc. It's correct morally. This totalitarian regime has all these companies that are run and that run the country. Basically, what U.S. policy says is not necessarily sanctions over entire countries. Basically, sanctions against these companies, which of course, unfortunately, keep us totalitarian. So it involves just about every sector of human society.
Thank you. We want to open it up for questions. Mark, did you have a question?
This is a question for Mauricio, and the Congressman wants to respond, so it touches a little bit of what the Congressman was saying. Given the travel restrictions that were tightened back in 2004, also restrictions on remittances, do you have any idea of what economic effect that has had on the Cuban government, specifically in numbers? Also, given that Cuba has been receiving a lot more money from Venezuela, is it really going to have that much of an effect?
I don't think you can see the 2004 restrictions in that. Like, remittances they were not cut. They were actually just the scope of who you can send remittances to was cut down, but the amount was not cut in itself. But in regards, what you have seen more than the economic impact, which the Congressman was right at one point, they talked about $500 million or so a year that has been cut. At the end of the day, when you're talking about a $6 billion economy, it's a good chunk of change. Now, there is money coming in, which nobody really knows where the hell it's going. There's 75,000 barrels of oil a day coming in from Venezuela. Now, somehow that's not getting registered in the Cuban economy. It's definitely not getting registered with the people. And somehow it's, I don't know if the government is selling it on the spot market. No one really knows what they're doing, or a couple of corrupt officials are doing it. But here's the reality in that sense. The people on the island are hustling on a daily basis to survive. Senior regime officials are stealing on a daily basis to survive. They're going off and they're going to third countries and their buddies and they're stealing containers of tobacco, containers of rum, and they're going off and saying, hey, how can we do it? At the end of the day, there's a shortage of hard currency on the island. So, the Cuban government can try to, say, hey, we're doing great and, you're not going to get rid of us, so that in fact then we could have this effect. So then people will say, well, look, at the end of the day, the regime's not going to crumble because look, we're getting money from here, here, here. But it's not tangible. No one is seeing it. It's not being reported in the economy. The family issue comes. It's an issue. You can shut me up at any time now because I know I ramble. But the family
Just
issue.
another 10 seconds so we can give the Congressman a second and give more people time to ask questions.
But I'm sure someone will ask about the family issue, so I'll leave that part for.
I have nothing to add. Yeah, there's money coming in from Chavez. That's part of the reason that the economy has picked up in recent years. There's also a lot of Chinese investment. It just shows how limited our ability is by restricting remittances. $500 million hasn't been stopped. Remittances still find a way to get there, and that's the goal. And if that goal were achieved, it would still have very little impact.
Other questions? Comments? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. While I understand the economic theory and hope that if we were to economically interact with the Cuban government, it would trickle down to the people. Obviously, we all want to support the civil society. As the ties between clearly anti-American countries in the Western Hemisphere continue to grow, Venezuela with Iran, Bolivia, I'm personally concerned by what it would look like, what would happen politically and economically for the U.S. to essentially bow down to the Cuban government and open up our markets. What would that say to the rest of the hemisphere and do for our national security as well?
Congressman. That's a very good question, and that's, I take the flip side completely. This is often cast here in Congress, and this is one of the reasons we have a difficult job changing this policy, is that if we open up travel and trade, we're somehow making concessions to the Castro government. When I say this completely the opposite, this is exactly what they want. Despite their protestations to the contrary, this embargo has done more, in my view, to keep that regime in power than anything. And so the notion that we would say we're going to have free trade with these countries is somehow a concession is just not correct, nor would it be viewed that way, I think, by the rest of Latin America. We should be concerned about our Cuba policy and how it affects the rest of Latin America. And I think that it has a very detrimental effect right now because those countries are dealing with Cuba. They see this irrational policy that we have. We can't have the principal policy that we have always had is that engagement is more likely to work than not, and that if we don't know, the default should always be freedom. We should allow Americans the freedom to travel and to trade. And so that's not giving in, that's actually expressing our principles.
Mauricio?
I think, kind of to follow up on what you're saying, there's also a big regional component and a big regional danger. On September 11, 2001, the Inter-American Democratic Charter was signed. Basically, 34 out of 35 countries in this hemisphere said that in order to have, that we recognize, political democracy, political freedom and democracy as, basically the most important issues for our hemispheric relations. So we have now a hemispheric policy. If we all of a sudden now go and engage with this regime and concede certain commercial and political concessions to them, the message that sends, now other countries might be willing to violate that, they don't care. But we're the United States. We should be a leader, and we should be a hemispheric leader. And as such, if we have agreed to this in this charter, in this Inter-American Democratic Charter, the message we would be sending to other countries, to the Chavezes of the world that, is moving towards, a dictatorship, but was democratically elected, would be, hey, go ahead, just finish it up. Take complete control, become a dictator, because at the end of the day, if we're not following the charter with Cuba, we're not going to follow with you. So we have a regional leadership issue that I think is very important in that regard. And I think the responsible left, we talk about Chavez and Vice, but there's a responsible left, Honduras and the Bachelet, etc., that have domestic political concerns, and which is why sometimes publicly they don't want to speak out too much against the Cuban regime because they don't want the Cubans and Cuban intelligence to start mobilizing, the fringe in their countries. But then there's also in the private, if they understand that this regime has to go, and work to help the Cuban civil society, etc. So,
Thank you. Another question? Or comment from? Here's your chance. You don't oftentimes get, yes ma'am, all the way back. Jeff over there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, we talked a lot about travel today, and wonder if you have any views on agriculture and looking to ban in order to support more agriculture.
Well, we trade now, we do about between 300 million and 500 million a year in ag sales to Cuba, ever since 2000 when food and medicine was allowed. That's a good thing. I don't know how that could be a bad thing. Often our policy is to deprive the Cuban government of hard currency. What better way to have them pay hard currency for our agricultural products? And Cubans eat better than they did before. They have what they call down there fat chickens. Chickens from the U.S. They call them fat chickens. They're better. So it's a good thing. I don't know how that is somehow allowing them to purchase our ag goods hurts anything.
I agree with that, and I agree with the fact that selling the products for hardwoods and taking hardwoods. The problem is we don't stop there. You know, they want credit, they want financing, they want the United States government and the United States taxpayer, this was considered almost close to that, you know, flipping the bill for the Cuban government's own ag purchases from a totally indebted regime, you know, the second worst credit risk in the world. And if I can just correct something, it's not, you know, we're not selling agricultural products to Cuba, we're selling agricultural products to Allenport. I'm about giving financing and everything the moment that Cuban people are able to say, you know what, I want to import products from the United States. And give them all the financing you want, because then it makes sense. But I'm not about promoting any foreign monopoly, and Allenport is a monopoly.
Let me just add on to that.
I thought I'd get the response out of you from that one.
Well, I mean, I don't have any ag sales in my district. That's not what motivates me on this issue. But the same people who favor the current policy have tried every way possible to restrict ag sales to Cuba, regardless of what is said. And whether it's payment in advance or whatever else. And I vote against every subsidy to any foreign government or a credit offered to them. That's not what this is about. But private ag companies here or financial institutions should take their own risk. And we should get in the middle of that transaction. We simply shouldn't subsidize it. So if they think that Cuba's a good risk, I don't, frankly, myself. But they should be able to make that choice themselves.
Let me wrap up, because I think, Chandler, if I'm not mistaken, maybe the congressman's getting called for a vote. Thank you to Congressman Flake's staff, Chandler Morris, for helping us line this up. I want to just thank all of you once again. When I look out in the front row and see people on their third and fourth sheet of notes, I know we've had a successful event. Please continue to come to Capitol Hill Mercatus Center events. Please don't be shy about telling us what we need to do in terms of program events that are important to you and speakers that are interesting to you. And please join me one final time in applause for thanking our